The letter arrived at the Hungarian Ministry of Defense in Budapest on a grey November morning in 1944. Its contents were so extraordinary that the censorship officer read it 3 times before deciding whether to forward it to his superiors. Written by Sergeant István Nagy, a Hungarian soldier captured during the failed defense of Romania. The letter described his experience as a prisoner of war in America in terms that seemed almost blasphemous to officials of a nation struggling under the weight of total war. "Dear Mother," Nagy had written, "I know you will not believe what I am about to tell you, but I must speak the truth. The Americans have placed us in what can only be described as paradise on earth." The censorship officer, Captain Peter Molnar, had processed thousands of prisoner letters during his 3 years of service, most of them filled with complaints about poor food, harsh treatment, and desperate pleas for packages from home. But Nagy's letter painted a picture so radically different from everything Molnar understood about prisoner of war camps that it challenged his fundamental assumptions about the nature of captivity and the character of Hungary's enemies. The American camps, according to Nagy, provided 3 meals a day of food, better than most Hungarian civilians had seen since before the war. Recreational facilities that included libraries and sports fields, and treatment so humane that many prisoners were reluctant to discuss repatriation. What Captain Molnar could not have known was that he was reading one of thousands of similar letters that would flow from Hungarian prisoners in American camps throughout 1944 and 1945. Each one described experiences that seemed to contradict everything the Hungarian government had told its people about their American enemies. These letters would eventually force Hungarian officials to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their soldiers were not suffering in enemy hands, but were instead experiencing a standard of living that exceeded what most Hungarian citizens enjoyed in their own homeland. The story of Hungarian prisoners of war in America begins with the collapse of the Eastern Front in the summer of 1944, when Soviet forces launched Operation Brian and shattered German Army Group Center. Hungarian units fighting alongside their German allies, in desperate attempts to halt the Soviet advance, found themselves cut off and surrounded as the Wehrmachta's defensive lines crumbled under the weight of overwhelming Soviet superiority in men and material. Thousands of Hungarian soldiers, many of them barely out of their teens, faced a terrible choice: surrender to the Soviets and face almost certain death in the gulags, or attempt to break through to German lines and continue a war that was clearly lost. For many Hungarian units, a third option presented itself when American and British forces began accepting surrenders from Axis troops who could reach Allied lines. The Western Allies, bound by the Geneva Convention and their own humanitarian principles, offered treatment that was dramatically different from what Hungarian soldiers could expect from Soviet captives. Word spread quickly through Hungarian ranks that surrender to the Americans meant survival, adequate food, and treatment according to international law, rather than the summary execution or slave labor that awaited those captured by the Red Army. The first large groups of Hungarian prisoners arrived in the United States in the autumn of 1944. Transported across the Atlantic in converted passenger ships that had been requisitioned for military service. These men, many of whom had never traveled more than a few miles from their villages before the war, found themselves on a journey that would take them further from home than they had ever imagined possible. The voyage itself was a revelation, as Hungarian prisoners discovered that even as captives aboard American ships, they received better food and medical care than they had known as soldiers in their own army. Sergeant István Nagy, whose letter had so shocked the Hungarian censorship officer, was among the first Hungarian prisoners to arrive at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, a sprawling facility that had been hastily expanded to accommodate the flood of Axis prisoners captured during the Allied advance across Europe. Nagy, a mathematics teacher from a small town near Debrecen, had been drafted into the Hungarian army in 1943 and had spent less than a year in uniform before his capture during the retreat from Romania. His background as an educated civilian rather than a career soldier gave him a unique perspective on the contrast between Hungarian and American approaches to prisoner treatment. The initial shock experienced by Hungarian prisoners upon arrival at American camps was profound and lasting. Men who had been told by their officers that capture by the Americans would mean torture, starvation, and forced labor instead found themselves in facilities that seemed almost luxurious compared to the conditions they had endured in their own military service. The barracks were heated in winter and ventilated in summer. The food was abundant and varied, and the guards, while maintaining necessary security, treated prisoners with a respect that many had never experienced from their own officers. The daily routine at American prisoner camps was regulated by the Geneva Convention, which required that prisoners receive the same food rations as American soldiers, adequate medical care, and opportunities for recreation and education. For Hungarian prisoners accustomed to the harsh discipline and poor conditions of their own military, this treatment seemed almost unbelievable. They were provided with 3 substantial meals per day, including meat, vegetables, bread, and dairy products that many had not tasted since before the war began. The contrast with the meager rations available to Hungarian civilians was so stark that many prisoners felt guilty about their relative abundance. The medical care provided to Hungarian prisoners was particularly impressive to men who had served in an army where medical supplies were scarce and treatment was often primitive. American camp hospitals were staffed by qualified doctors and nurses, equipped with modern medical equipment, and stocked with medications that were unavailable to Hungarian forces. Prisoners who had suffered from untreated injuries or illnesses during their military service found themselves receiving care that exceeded what many Hungarian civilians could obtain in their homeland. The recreational facilities available to Hungarian prisoners were perhaps the most shocking aspect of their American captivity. Camps included libraries stocked with books in multiple languages, sports fields where prisoners could play soccer and other games, and workshops where they could learn new skills or practice existing trades. Many camps organized educational programs that allowed prisoners to study English, American history, or technical subjects that would be useful in civilian life. This emphasis on prisoner welfare and personal development was completely foreign to Hungarian military culture, where soldiers were expected to endure hardship without complaint. The work programs established for Hungarian prisoners in American camps provided another source of amazement for men accustomed to the harsh labor conditions of their homeland. Prisoners who volunteered for work details were paid wages for their labor, treated fairly by their supervisors, and given tasks that were meaningful rather than punitive. Many Hungarian prisoners worked on farms, in factories, or on construction projects, where they learned new skills while contributing to the American war effort. The irony that enemy prisoners were being treated better than many American workers had been during the Great Depression was not lost on the more perceptive Hungarian captives. The cultural exchange that occurred between Hungarian prisoners and their American guards was facilitated by the relatively relaxed atmosphere of the camps and the genuine curiosity that many Americans showed about European culture and history. Guards who had never traveled outside the United States found themselves learning about Hungarian traditions, language, and customs from prisoners who were eager to share their heritage with people who showed genuine interest. This cultural dialogue helped humanize both captives and guards, creating relationships that transcended the formal prisoner-guard dynamic. The letters that Hungarian prisoners wrote home during their captivity provide a unique window into their psychological transformation and growing appreciation for American values and culture. Initially, many prisoners wrote cautiously, unsure whether their letters were being censored and afraid to express opinions that might be considered treasonous. But as time passed and they realized that American authorities allowed considerable freedom of expression, their letters became more candid in describing their experiences and more critical of the conditions they had left behind in Hungary. The contrast between American abundance and Hungarian scarcity was a constant theme in prisoner correspondence. Men who had grown up in a country where shortages were common and rationing was a way of life found themselves in a nation where even prisoners enjoyed a standard of living that exceeded what most Hungarian families could achieve. The abundance of food, clothing, medical care, and recreational opportunities available to prisoners seemed almost miraculous to men who had known only scarcity and hardship. The democratic principles that governed American prisoner camps were equally foreign and impressive to Hungarian prisoners who had lived under authoritarian rule for most of their lives. Prisoners were allowed to elect representatives to communicate with camp authorities, to organize their own recreational activities, and to express complaints or suggestions through established channels. This participatory approach to camp governance provided Hungarian prisoners with their first experience of democratic decision-making and individual rights within a collective framework. The religious freedom available to Hungarian prisoners was another source of amazement for men who had come from a country where religious expression was increasingly restricted under German influence. American camps provided chaplains for different faiths, allowed prisoners to conduct their own religious services, and respected individual beliefs without attempting to impose any particular doctrine. For Hungarian prisoners who were devoutly Catholic or Protestant, this religious tolerance was a powerful demonstration of American values and democratic principles. The educational opportunities available to Hungarian prisoners exceeded anything they could have accessed in their homeland. Even in peacetime, American authorities organized classes in English language, American history, democratic government, and technical skills that would be valuable in post-war reconstruction. Many prisoners who had received only basic education in rural Hungarian schools found themselves with access to learning opportunities that would have been impossible in their previous circumstances. The psychological impact of American treatment on Hungarian prisoners was profound and lasting. Men who had been taught to expect brutality and exploitation from their enemies instead experienced kindness, respect, and genuine concern for their welfare. This cognitive dissonance forced many prisoners to reconsider their assumptions about American society and to question the propaganda they had been fed about their enemies' character and intentions. The social dynamics within Hungarian prisoner groups also evolved as they adapted to American camp life. Traditional military hierarchies began to break down as prisoners realized that their American guards judged men by their character and behavior rather than their rank or social background. This democratic leveling was both liberating and disturbing for prisoners who had grown up in a highly stratified society where social position determined life opportunities. The economic lessons that Hungarian prisoners learned from their American experience were equally transformative. They observed an economic system that seemed capable of producing abundance for everyone, including enemy prisoners, rather than the zero-sum competition for scarce resources that characterized their homeland. The efficiency and productivity of American agriculture and industry, which they witnessed through work programs and educational tours, provided models for economic development that many prisoners hoped to implement in post-war Hungary. The technological superiority of American society was evident in every aspect of camp life, from the modern plumbing and electrical systems in the barracks to the sophisticated medical equipment in the hospitals. Hungarian prisoners, many of whom came from rural areas where modern conveniences were rare, found themselves living with amenities that exceeded what most Hungarian cities could provide. This technological gap was both impressive and intimidating, suggesting an American society that was decades ahead of European development. As 1944 turned to 1945, and news of the war's progress filtered into the camps, Hungarian prisoners faced the sobering reality that their homeland was being occupied by Soviet forces, whose treatment of prisoners and civilians was dramatically different from what they were experiencing in America. The contrast between their comfortable captivity and the harsh fate awaiting their families and friends under Soviet occupation created complex emotions of guilt, gratitude, and anxiety about the future. But perhaps the most profound transformation occurring among Hungarian prisoners was their growing understanding of democratic values and individual rights that would influence their post-war lives and their contributions to Hungarian society. The men who would eventually return to Hungary would carry with them not just memories of American abundance, but a new understanding of human dignity, democratic governance, and individual opportunity that would challenge the authoritarian systems they had known. The spring of 1945 brought an unexpected crisis to Camp Shelby that would forever change how Hungarian prisoners viewed their captivity and their captors. Word had arrived that the war in Europe was ending, and with it came the sobering reality that Hungarian prisoners would soon face repatriation to a homeland now under Soviet occupation. What should have been a moment of celebration instead became a source of profound anxiety, as many prisoners realized they were about to leave what they had come to consider paradise for an uncertain future under communist rule. Sergeant Istvan Nagy, who had spent nearly a year in American captivity, found himself in the unprecedented position of dreading his return to freedom. The psychological complexity of this situation was not lost on American camp authorities, who had witnessed a remarkable transformation in their Hungarian charges over the months of captivity. Men who had arrived as defeated enemies, expecting harsh treatment and brutal conditions, had instead discovered a society that treated even its enemies with dignity and respect. The Hungarian prisoners had not merely survived their captivity, they had thrived in it, developing new skills, forming friendships with their guards, and experiencing a standard of living that exceeded what most had known in their homeland. The daily routine that had evolved at Camp Shelby and similar facilities across America represented a unique experiment in democratic prisoner management that challenged traditional assumptions about captivity and rehabilitation. Hungarian prisoners woke each morning to the sound of American reveille. But unlike the harsh discipline they had known in their own military, the American approach emphasized voluntary participation and personal responsibility. Prisoners were expected to maintain their quarters, attend work assignments, and participate in recreational activities, but the enforcement was based on mutual respect rather than fear of punishment. The work programs that had been established for Hungarian prisoners provided perhaps the most profound education in American values and economic principles. Unlike the forced labor that characterized prisoner treatment in other nations, American work assignments were voluntary, fairly compensated, and designed to provide useful skills that would benefit prisoners after their release. Hungarian prisoners worked alongside American civilians in factories, farms, and construction projects, earning wages that they could save or spend in camp stores that offered goods unavailable to most European civilians. Private Joseph Kovat, a young farmer from the Hungarian plains who had been drafted into the army just months before his capture, found himself working on an American farm in Mississippi, where he learned modern agricultural techniques that revolutionized his understanding of food production. The American farmer who supervised his work, a man named Tom Johnson whose own son was fighting in the Pacific, treated Kovat not as an enemy prisoner, but as a student eager to learn. This relationship, repeated thousands of times across American prison camps, created bonds of mutual respect and understanding that transcended national boundaries and political differences. The educational opportunities available to Hungarian prisoners exceeded anything they could have accessed in their homeland. Even during peacetime, American authorities had organized comprehensive programs that included English language instruction, American history and civics classes, technical training in various trades, and even university-level courses for prisoners with sufficient educational background. The libraries established in the camps contained thousands of books in multiple languages, including Hungarian classics that many prisoners had never had the opportunity to read. The democratic governance structures that emerged within the prisoner communities provided Hungarian captives with their first experience of participatory decision-making and individual rights within a collective framework. Prisoners elected representatives to communicate with camp authorities, organized their own recreational activities, and established informal courts to resolve disputes among themselves. This self-governance was supervised, but not controlled by American authorities, who recognized that allowing prisoners to manage their own affairs was both more efficient and more educational than imposing external authority. The cultural exchange that flourished between Hungarian prisoners and their American guards created lasting friendships that would endure long after the war ended. Guards who had never traveled outside their home states found themselves learning about European history, Hungarian folk music, and Central European cuisine from prisoners who were eager to share their heritage. In return, prisoners learned about American regional cultures, democratic traditions, and the immigrant experiences that had shaped American society. These exchanges humanized both groups and created understanding that transcended the formal prisoner-guard relationship. The religious freedom that Hungarian prisoners experienced in American camps was particularly meaningful to men who had come from a country where religious expression was increasingly restricted under German influence. American authorities provided chaplains for different faiths, allowed prisoners to conduct their own religious services, and respected individual beliefs without attempting to impose any particular doctrine. The camp at Shelby even constructed a small chapel where Hungarian prisoners could worship according to their own traditions, a gesture of respect that deeply moved men who had expected persecution rather than tolerance. The medical care provided to Hungarian prisoners continued to amaze men who had served in an army where medical supplies were scarce and treatment was often primitive. The camp hospital was staffed by qualified American doctors and nurses who treated prisoners with the same care they would provide to American soldiers. Many Hungarian prisoners received medical attention for conditions that had gone untreated for years, including dental care, eye examinations, and treatment for chronic illnesses that had been ignored by Hungarian military medical services. The recreational facilities available to prisoners provided opportunities for physical fitness, artistic expression, and intellectual development that exceeded what most Hungarian civilians could access in their homeland. The camps included sports fields where prisoners could play soccer, volleyball, and even learn American sports like baseball and basketball. Art studios allowed prisoners with artistic talents to paint, sculpt, and create works that express their experiences and emotions. Music rooms provided instruments for prisoners who wanted to form bands or orchestras, leading to performances that entertained both prisoners and guards. The food provided to Hungarian prisoners remained a constant source of amazement throughout their captivity. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive the same rations as American soldiers, which meant 3 substantial meals per day, including meat, vegetables, dairy products, and fresh bread. For men who had grown up in a country where meat was a luxury and fresh vegetables were seasonal rarities, the abundance and variety of American camp food seemed almost miraculous. Many prisoners gained weight during their captivity, a stark contrast to the malnutrition that was common among prisoners in other nations. The correspondence that Hungarian prisoners maintained with their families provided a unique window into their psychological transformation and growing appreciation for American values. Initially cautious and formal, their letters gradually became more candid, as prisoners realized that American authorities allowed considerable freedom of expression. The contrast between their comfortable captivity and the harsh conditions their families faced under Soviet occupation created complex emotions of guilt, gratitude, and anxiety about the future. The economic lessons that Hungarian prisoners learned from their American experience were perhaps the most transformative aspect of their captivity. They observed an economic system that seemed capable of producing abundance for everyone, including enemy prisoners, rather than the zero-sum competition for scarce resources that characterized their homeland. The efficiency and productivity of American agriculture and industry, which they witnessed through work programs and educational tours, provided models for economic development that many prisoners hoped to implement in post-war Hungary. The technological superiority of American society was evident in every aspect of camp life, from the modern plumbing and electrical systems in the barracks to the sophisticated machinery used in work programs. Hungarian prisoners, many of whom came from rural areas where modern conveniences were rare, found themselves living with amenities that exceeded what most Hungarian cities could provide. This technological gap was both impressive and intimidating, suggesting an American society that was decades ahead of European development. The social dynamics within Hungarian prisoner groups evolved significantly as they adapted to American camp life and absorbed democratic values. Traditional military hierarchies began to break down as prisoners realized that their American captors judged men by their character and behavior rather than their rank or social background. This democratic leveling was both liberating and disturbing for prisoners who had grown up in a highly stratified society where social position determined life opportunities. The psychological counseling that some Hungarian prisoners received from American military chaplains and social workers provided them with tools for coping with trauma and planning for their future that were unavailable in their homeland. Many prisoners had experienced significant psychological stress during their military service and capture, and the supportive environment of American camps allowed them to process these experiences in ways that promoted healing and personal growth. The language skills that Hungarian prisoners developed during their captivity would prove invaluable in their post-war lives. English instruction was available at multiple levels, from basic conversation to advanced technical vocabulary, and many prisoners achieved fluency that would allow them to serve as translators and cultural bridges between Hungary and America. The ability to communicate directly with Americans without interpreters created deeper relationships and better understanding of American culture and values. The artistic and cultural productions that emerged from Hungarian prisoner communities provided outlets for creative expression and cultural preservation that enriched both prisoner and guard experiences. Hungarian prisoners organized folk dance performances, traditional music concerts, and art exhibitions that introduced Americans to Central European culture, while allowing prisoners to maintain connections to their heritage. These cultural events became popular with local American communities, creating positive relationships that extended beyond the camp boundaries. The vocational training programs available to Hungarian prisoners provided practical skills that would be valuable in post-war reconstruction efforts. Prisoners could learn carpentry, electrical work, automotive repair, and other trades that were in high demand in war-torn Europe. Many prisoners who had been farmers or laborers before the war acquired technical skills that would allow them to pursue better-paying careers after their release. The democratic political education that Hungarian prisoners received through formal classes and informal discussions with American guards and civilians provided them with understanding of constitutional government, individual rights, and civic responsibility that would influence their post-war political activities. Many prisoners who had lived under authoritarian rule for their entire lives discovered concepts of limited government, separation of powers, and individual liberty that challenged their previous understanding of political organization. The entrepreneurial opportunities that some Hungarian prisoners discovered through camp work programs introduced them to American business practices and free market economics that contrasted sharply with the state-controlled economy they had known in Hungary. Prisoners who worked in American businesses observed management techniques, customer service practices, and innovation processes that would influence their post-war economic activities. As the war in Europe drew to a close, and the reality of repatriation became imminent, Hungarian prisoners faced the complex challenge of reconciling their positive American experiences with their loyalty to their homeland and their concerns about life under Soviet occupation. Many prisoners who had initially looked forward to returning home now dreaded leaving the security and abundance they had found in American captivity for an uncertain future under communist rule. The relationships that Hungarian prisoners had formed with American guards and civilians created lasting bonds that would continue through correspondence and visits long after the war ended. Many Americans who had worked with Hungarian prisoners developed genuine affection and respect for men they had initially seen as enemies. While prisoners carried with them grateful memories of American kindness and generosity that would influence their attitudes toward America for the rest of their lives. But perhaps the most significant transformation that occurred among Hungarian prisoners was their adoption of democratic values and individual rights that would influence their post-war contributions to Hungarian society and their resistance to communist authoritarianism. The men who would eventually return to Hungary would carry with them not just memories of American abundance, but a new understanding of human dignity and democratic governance that would challenge the totalitarian systems they would face at home. The repatriation ship that departed New York Harbor in June 1945 carried within its hull a cargo more precious than gold. Nearly 3,000 Hungarian prisoners of war whose minds had been forever changed by their encounter with American democracy. Sergeant István Nagy stood at the ship's rail, watching the Statue of Liberty fade into the morning mist, clutching a small American flag that had been given to him by his former guard, Corporal Billy Thompson from Alabama. In his pocket was a letter of recommendation from the camp commander, written in English and Hungarian, attesting to his character and work ethic during his 18 months of captivity. But more valuable than any document was the transformation that had occurred within Nagy's understanding of human dignity, individual rights, and democratic governance. The journey back to Europe was markedly different from the voyage that had brought these men to America as defeated enemies. Now they traveled as men who had experienced something unprecedented in the history of warfare, captivity that had been more comfortable and educational than their previous lives as free citizens. The irony was not lost on the more thoughtful among them that they were leaving paradise to return to a homeland that had become a prison under Soviet occupation. The conversations that filled the ship's holds were subdued, marked by anxiety about what awaited them and gratitude for what they were leaving behind. The contrast between their American experience and the reality that greeted them in Soviet-controlled Hungary was immediate and shocking. The repatriation center at Depression, where Hungarian prisoners were processed for return to civilian life, was a grim facility where former prisoners faced interrogation about their activities during captivity, suspicion about their loyalty to the new communist government, and warnings about the consequences of spreading capitalist propaganda among the Hungarian population. The abundance and freedom they had known in America seemed like a distant dream in the face of Soviet-style authoritarianism. Private Isefkovich, the young farmer who had learned modern agricultural techniques on an American farm in Mississippi, returned to find his family's land confiscated by the communist government and redistributed to collective farms. The farming methods he had learned in America, which could have dramatically increased Hungarian agricultural productivity, were dismissed as bourgeois techniques unsuitable for socialist agriculture. The seeds he had carefully saved from American crops were confiscated as potential tools of capitalist infiltration, and his attempts to share his knowledge were met with suspicion and hostility from party officials. The psychological adjustment required of returning Hungarian prisoners was enormous and often traumatic. Men who had spent months or years in an environment that respected individual dignity and encouraged personal development found themselves in a society where conformity was demanded and independent thinking was dangerous. The democratic values they had absorbed in American camps, freedom of expression, individual rights, participatory decision-making, were not merely discouraged, but actively suppressed by the new communist authorities. The letters that former prisoners attempted to write to their American friends and former guards were heavily censored or blocked entirely by Hungarian postal authorities who viewed any contact with Americans as potentially subversive. The friendships that had been formed across national and ideological boundaries were severed by political necessity, leaving former prisoners isolated with their memories of a better world they could no longer access or openly discuss. Despite the official hostility toward their American experiences, many former prisoners found subtle ways to share the lessons they had learned and to plant seeds of democratic thinking in Hungarian soil. István Nagy, who had returned to his teaching position, incorporated American educational methods into his mathematics classes, emphasizing problem-solving and critical thinking rather than rote memorization. While he could not openly discuss American democracy, he could model democratic teaching methods that encouraged student participation and independent thought. The technical skills that many prisoners had acquired during their American captivity proved valuable in Hungary's post-war reconstruction efforts. Even as the political lessons they had learned were suppressed, former prisoners who had learned modern manufacturing techniques, agricultural methods, and construction skills found themselves in high demand for reconstruction projects. Though they were careful to present their knowledge as personal innovation rather than American training, the underground networks that formed among former prisoners provided crucial support for men struggling to readjust to life under communist rule, while maintaining their democratic values and American connections. These informal groups met in private homes, shared news from America when it could be obtained, and provided mutual support for members facing political persecution. The bonds formed in American prison camps had created a community of shared values that persisted despite official attempts to suppress it. The economic insights that former prisoners had gained from their American experience influenced their understanding of Hungary's post-war economic challenges and the failures of communist central planning. Men who had witnessed American productivity and abundance could see clearly the inefficiencies and shortcomings of the Soviet economic model being imposed on Hungary. While they could not openly criticize the system, their private conversations and personal decisions were informed by their knowledge of alternative economic arrangements. The religious freedom that former prisoners had experienced in America made the communist government's attacks on Hungarian churches particularly painful and meaningful. Men who had worshipped freely in American camps and had been treated with respect regardless of their faith found themselves in a society where religious expression was increasingly restricted and believers faced discrimination and persecution. Many former prisoners became quiet defenders of religious liberty, using their understanding of American religious tolerance to support fellow believers. The families of former prisoners often struggled to understand the changes that had occurred in their loved ones during captivity. Wives and children who had expected their men to return broken and traumatized, instead found them confident, skilled, and filled with new ideas about human rights and democratic governance. These family dynamics created both opportunities and tensions, as former prisoners attempted to share their insights while protecting their families from political persecution. The communist government's attempts to use former prisoners as propaganda tools backfired when many refused to denounce their American captors or to describe their treatment as harsh or inhumane. Official efforts to organize testimonials about American brutality were undermined by former prisoners who insisted on telling the truth about their experiences, forcing authorities to abandon these propaganda campaigns and instead try to silence the prisoners entirely. The long-term impact of the Hungarian prisoners' American experience became evident during the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, when many former prisoners played leadership roles in the uprising against communist rule. Their understanding of democratic principles, gained during their captivity in America, provided intellectual foundation for the revolution's goals and methods. While the revolution was ultimately crushed by Soviet intervention, the democratic ideals that had been planted in American prison camps continued to influence Hungarian resistance to communist authoritarianism. The immigration waves that followed the 1956 revolution included many former prisoners, who used their English language skills and knowledge of American culture to successfully resettle in the United States. These men who had first encountered America as prisoners of war returned as immigrants seeking the freedom and opportunity they had glimpsed during their captivity. Their success in American society validated the lessons they had learned about democratic values and individual opportunity. The correspondence that eventually resumed between former prisoners and their American friends provided crucial links between Hungary and the free world during the darkest years of communist rule. Letters smuggled through neutral countries carried news of conditions in Hungary to American friends who had maintained interest in the welfare of their former prisoners. These connections helped maintain international awareness of Hungarian suffering and resistance to communist oppression. The children and grandchildren of former prisoners grew up hearing stories about America that shaped their understanding of freedom, democracy, and human rights. While these stories had to be shared carefully and privately, they created a generational transmission of democratic values that would influence Hungarian society for decades. Many of these second- and third-generation Hungarians would play important roles in the peaceful transition to democracy that occurred in 1989. The educational impact of the prisoners' American experience extended beyond their immediate families to influence Hungarian intellectual and cultural development. Former prisoners who became teachers, writers, and professionals carried with them insights about democratic education, free expression, and individual creativity that slowly influenced Hungarian cultural life despite official restrictions. The seeds of democratic thinking planted in American prison camps grew slowly but persistently in Hungarian soil. The economic entrepreneurship that some former prisoners had observed in America influenced their approach to the limited private economic activity that was permitted under communist rule. Men who had learned about free market principles and business innovation found ways to apply these lessons within the constraints of the socialist system, often achieving remarkable success in small-scale enterprises that provided better goods and services than state-controlled businesses. The technological knowledge that former prisoners had acquired in America proved valuable in Hungary's industrial development even as the political lessons they had learned were suppressed. Engineers and technicians who had worked with modern American equipment were able to contribute to Hungarian industrial projects, though they were careful to present their knowledge as personal innovation rather than American training. The humanitarian values that former prisoners had absorbed through their treatment in American camps influenced their behavior toward others throughout their lives. Men who had experienced kindness and respect from their former enemies became advocates for tolerance and human dignity in their own communities, often at personal risk during periods of political persecution. The legacy of the Hungarian prisoners' American experience became fully evident only after the fall of communism in 1989, when former prisoners and their families could finally speak openly about their experiences and their impact on Hungarian society. The democratic transition that occurred in Hungary was facilitated by the presence of people who understood democratic principles, and had witnessed their practical application in American society. The monuments and memorials that were eventually erected to honor the Hungarian prisoners' experience recognized not only their suffering during the war, but also their role in saving and sharing democratic values during the communist period. These memorials accepted that the prisoners' captivity in America had been a source of learning and hope rather than trauma and shame. The historical research that came after 1989 showed the full impact of the prisoners' influence on Hungarian society and their role in keeping connections between Hungary and the democratic world during the communist period. Scholars found wide networks of former prisoners who had quietly kept American friendships, democratic values, and free market principles alive throughout decades of strict rule. The reunion visits that happened between former prisoners and their American guards and friends in the 1990s gave emotional peace to relationships that had been stopped by political problems. These reunions showed the lasting power of human connections made across national and political lines and proved the humanitarian principles that had guided American treatment of prisoners during the war. The story of Hungarian prisoners who called American camps paradise on earth finally became a story about the power of kind treatment to change enemies into friends and the ability of democratic values to live and grow even under the hardest situations. These men had lived in captivity that was more comfortable and more useful than their earlier lives as free citizens. And they carried the lessons of that experience with them for the rest of their lives. Their change from defeated enemies to supporters of democracy showed the success of American values and the wisdom of treating even enemies with dignity and respect. The seeds of democratic thinking that were planted in American prison camps grew slowly but strongly, later helping the peaceful change to democracy that transformed Hungary and the rest of Eastern Europe. The memory of their experience still matters today, reminding us that even in the middle of world conflict, human kindness and democratic values can cross political borders and create lasting bonds between former enemies. The Hungarian prisoners who found paradise in American captivity proved that the principles of human dignity, individual rights, and democratic government have worldwide appeal and strong power that can live even in the darkest periods of strict rule. Their story stands as proof of the lasting strength of democratic ideas and the chance of change and growth even in the most unlikely situations. The men who returned from American paradise to communist Hungary carried with them not just memories of plenty and freedom, but a living example of what human society could achieve when guided by principles of dignity, respect, and democratic participation.